Okay, we'll come back to order at this time, and I'd like to invite Mr. Bundy up to give your 5-minute closing comments.
Try to be very brief and just address a few of the things that came up in the previous comments. This idea, this assertion that Mr. Murphy made that forests in California and the United States remove more CO2 every year than they emit is true on an annual snapshot basis. Yes, the forests in the United States and California are acting as a net sink for carbon dioxide when you consider just the annual sequestration. But this really does not capture the effect of a biomass plant over time when you project out into the future over decades or centuries. When you're taking wood out of the forest, even if more is growing back each year than you're taking out, you're nonetheless affecting the rate at which, going forward, that forest is able to grow and sequester even more carbon. Again, we're not talking about maintaining current elevated CO2 levels in the atmosphere. We're talking about managing forests in a way that is going to draw those levels down as quickly as possible. There are a couple scientific articles that have been submitted with our prior comments that address this, some new studies out of Oregon State that really go to this issue. Those are in the record. The issue is what the atmosphere sees over time, not just what the carbon stocks are in any given year. There were a couple comments about the open burning of slash and the assertion that this project will only use so-called wood waste. If this project were just about burning slash that would otherwise be piled and burned in the open in this valley or elsewhere, we'd be having a different conversation. If this project were really just about burning mill waste from the two mills that are from the Anderson mill and the other mill that's close by, we might be having a different conversation there too. The analysis would be quite different. But the conditions of approval for this project, specifically condition 11, don't limit the fuels to wood waste. They don't limit the fuels to slash that would otherwise be burned. Mr. Salazar put that condition up on the screen, and it's pretty much any legally harvested wood that's harvested for the purpose of fuel reduction or forest stand improvement. Now, I'm not a forester, but pretty much everything that's done out on the landscape is in one way or another, quote unquote, for forest stand improvement. Even clear cuts could qualify as that. I mean, I think, I'm not sure that SPI would agree in this forum, but I think in other places you'd have to make that assertion. So again, there just aren't really meaningful limitations on the kinds of wood that can be cut and burned in this project. The board could consider an amending condition 11 to limit it to slash that would otherwise be burned anyway, to limit it to mill waste, but that's not what you have before you. Finally, no, we're not in favor of coal-fired power plants. We need to get off of fossil fuels. We're not in favor of fracking up huge quantities of natural gas, potentially for the export market. We need to reduce those fossil CO2 emissions. And at the same time, when we're considering alternatives to fossil electricity generation, we have to evaluate among those alternatives as to which alternatives are really going to do the best job over the short term of really addressing the problem. And unfortunately, biomass generation over the short term increases CO2 emissions. The folks who spoke in opposition to the project didn't mention this up here. In conversations I've had today, there were a couple folks mentioned that they had commented on earlier versions of the project but did not receive notice of the subsequent recirculated EIRs. They should have received that notice. I just thought I would mention that because it's come up in my conversations this morning. In closing, our position is that the project should not be approved on the current EIR. Critical information has not been disclosed, and substantial evidence does not support the conclusion that the impacts are less than significant. I do want to thank you for your time and your courtesy, and also acknowledge that in my dealings with Mr. Salazar and Planning Commission staff, and also with the clerk of the board, people have been very courteous and professional, and I want to acknowledge in front of all of you the job that they do. So thank you again for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Bundy. Okay, Mr. Murphy.
Thank you again for the opportunity. Just a few things I think which are important. First of all, I believe it was in the slide and you have it in your work, but that CEQA doesn't require you guys to stay on top of the latest science. but I do want to clarify a piece of the latest science. The California Air Resources Board in December of 2010, which you'll notice the date was right in the middle of this multiple revisions of this draft EIR, announced the regulations for California Air the AB 32 requirements. And one of the sections of regulations that they produced was specifically biomass and how it was defined, much of which you see copied into the permit. That's the limitations on what we can burn in terms of a biomass boiler. But what's important about that regulation is that while we're embarking on the largest economic effort to control CO2 ever undertaken anywhere on the planet, the Air Resources Board said that people who burn biomass like this do not have to count it towards obligations or towards anything that you would have to offset to meet AB 32's requirements. So you are not inconsistent with the latest science. The Air Resources Board in December of 2010 put that regulation in place for the future in terms of biomass burning, in terms of whether or not biomass needs obligations under AB 32. Now, you could say that doesn't mean that they said it was carbon neutral. Well, that may be true. They may not have used that terminology, but they did not require people who burn biomass to count that towards CO2 produced, which in the law is being counted specifically to address the issues related to global warming and reduction of CO2 production. So you're not inconsistent with the California State Air Resources Board as to how to go forward. And one last issue, as I mentioned earlier in my conversation, we have been sued by these same folks. And the specific issue that was raised in the previous suits were over our timber harvest plans and whether or not even age management and whether or not rate of harvest and rate of growth was an impact on greenhouse gases in the state of California. They eventually sued us on 19 separate timber harvest plans in 8 separate counties. All of those were consolidated into a single lawsuit, and a retired judge in El Dorado County ruled definitively that they were wrong, that the CEQA process for a timber harvest plan had been followed correctly, that the State Department of California, Department of Forestry and Fire Protection did an adequate and complete and reasonable CEQA process in terms of determining that those plans were approved appropriately and that we provided the necessary data to demonstrate. It is an interesting concept that somehow there's this theory of forests that get depleted. Well, we have demonstrated an increasing rate of carbon sequestration by our management, almost tripling the rate at which carbon is taken out of the atmosphere by the very forest stand improvements that are allocated in this process. So you could say, okay, let's not build a biomass plant. Let's not let Sierra Pacific triple the rate of carbon sequestration in the forest. And where will you be? You'll have more fossil fuel being burned because Californians won't turn off their air conditioners, and you'll have less carbon being removed from the atmosphere by the practices that we employ in the forest. So this is not, like I said, this is not a rocket science problem. This is very, very clear and simple, and we have demonstrated it at the harvest plan level and won that case in court already, and that we are in this situation here arguing over identical issues. And once again, I think the board and the staff is correct. They did a complete and adequate job under CEQA to present the issues, to discuss those concerns, and to allow the public ample opportunity to raise the issue. And I believe the board is fully informed as a public agency in making its decision in this case. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Murphy. At this time, I will close the public hearing. I'd like to thank all of you that spoke, and both the applicant and appellant, for your professional and concise presentations today. At this time, I will turn it over to the board for questions and discussion, comments. Supervisor Baugh.
Thank you, Chair Hartman. And my thanks as well to those who spoke today. Appreciate the time that you've taken to come and address your local elected board. I'm going to start by addressing a comment specifically that I heard from Mr. Wagoner. I don't know if he's still here. Oh, he's left. Too bad. I find it incredibly offensive to have him stand before us and tell us that we kowtow to local business investors like SPI. Just for the record, for myself, speaking on my own behalf, I was not supported in my first election to the board by SPI. In fact, if I remember right, their marketing man voiced the commercials for my opposition. I was not supported in my second election by SPI, and no finances came my way. And in my recent run for state senate, they supported my opponent once again. So, Mr. Wagoner, I hope that you will hear these comments and in the future address perhaps fact and not conjecture. To Mr. Bundy, well, before I go there, I'll just ask a question. There was one issue that was brought up about insufficient legal notices. Now, I'm not asking for you to confirm the multiple newspaper accounts in various medias that I read myself or heard on the local television stations or the local radio broadcasts or even the public hearings. Has the county itself complied with all legal requirements and notification requirements, not only for this hearing, but leading up and including the Planning Commission hearings?
Thank you, Supervisor Baugh. What I'd like to do is have our outside counsel who's present here today, Kate Hart, who's been intimately involved in the process, answer your question, and there may also be some input from staff as well.
Thank you, Supervisor Baugh, for your question. I believe staff can address the factual issues specifically, but I have confirmed with staff that within, I believe the limitation for notification is 300 feet, and I believe staff can confirm that they gave that notice sufficiently. And I believe there was additional notice to 500 feet to the folks in the River Ranch subdivision, if that's the correct name of the neighborhood. And so that was actually extra notice over and above and beyond what is required by law to be given. And that was done for the EIR scoping meeting. And then, of course, there have always been published notifications in the newspaper, which is, I believe, the Record Searchlight. And Mr. Salazar can confirm those statements, I believe.
Thank you very much. Would you like to confirm those statements, Mr. Salazar?
Yes, if I could. I'll just touch on our approach for the scoping meeting. As you're aware, after reading the EIR, there was a health risk assessment that was prepared for this project. Basically, in our initial casting of the net for the scoping meeting, we went beyond our legal requirement, as Ms. Hart has stated, and we based that on where the prevailing winds were going to be going, as was showed in that health risk assessment. We did reach beyond the minimum requirement and notified homeowners in at least portions of the River Ranch neighborhood, including Ms. Wayman, who spoke to you today. Ms. Wayman, having attended the scoping meeting and expressing interest in this project, was then added to our general mailing list. She received all notices, or at least we mailed all notices to the address that we were given for her in that respect. And beyond that, we did meet the legal requirements for noticing of both the review periods for the document as well as all of the associated public hearings.
Thank you very much for confirming that. For Mr. Bundy, I listened intently to your presentation, as I mentioned before, to the arguments and the comments that you made, and frankly, in my opinion, I found them to be extremely weak. And you stated to begin with that you were basing your thoughts and comments to us on fact, and yet dotted throughout your comments were innuendo and not fact. And I want to point that out to you in your future presentations, that if you're in fact going to make statements of fact, you might want to not include the conjecture in them. My thoughts are this, and I'll yield the floor to the rest of the board. But I think the most significant thing that we heard here today, having read everything, having listened to the arguments that have been presented, is that this investment itself by SPI makes a tremendously significant statement as to what arguably the largest and most successful company in Shasta County believes is the state of Shasta County. They're making a tremendous investment, and by that investment, they are making a tremendous statement that Shasta County holds great promise for its future. I do count that as significant, and in fact, it is one of the things that we are asked to consider when considering this project. And Mr. Tullis, I think, summed it up very nicely, do the benefits of the project outweigh any possible detriment to the county or any possible impacts? And I would say, for my vote, absolutely yes. And it is my intention to support this. I see there's another speaker, so I'll allow that first. Otherwise, I just go ahead and make a motion. But
Supervisor Kehoe.
Thank you, Vice Chairman Hartman. My remarks will be brief. I believe that this process that we've all been engaged in speaks well of our community. I think the process has been transparent. I think it's been fair and impartial. I believe that all sides have had their say. And important to me, the comments have been respectfully given. I will also refer to a remark that Mr. Tullis made in his presentation when he indicated that there are an increasing number of appeals in Shasta County as to the projects, and the byproduct of that, or the consequence of that, is that projects have become subject to increased scrutiny. And I believe that's a positive thing. I think it adds purity and precision to the process. I have spent a good number of hours reading all of this material that has been given to us, reading the final EIR, and in my judgment, this project is efficacious, and I believe it to be legally sufficient. And I also am supportive of the project.
Thank you, Supervisor Kehoe. Supervisor Hawes?
Yes, I have to commend them for bringing a project forth like this with 128 conditions of mitigation. I can't believe, that's going to be a task in itself, just keeping ahead of every single one of those 128 conditions. So I have to commend you, Sierra Pacific, for sticking with it and bringing it forward. So I am total supportive, and I would much rather have fuel burnt in this process than the way it's been burned lately out in the woods, creating all of this smoke and whatever you want to call it. There's going to be a lot of debris there afterwards, too, to deal with, because we'll have erosion and all kinds of environmental concerns dealing with wildfires and their aftermath. So that's the way I feel about the project, and I think it's a very, very good one.
Thank you, Supervisor Hawes. I'll be brief as well. I'd like to, again, thank everyone for their comments today. I believe it's a quality project. I believe Sierra Pacific is committed to and has proven that they are working to maintain our healthy forests, our environment for all of us as we move forward. And I also will be supporting the project. Supervisor Baugh, did you have additional comment?
just want to make a motion.
Okay.
Are you ready for motion?
Yeah, if you're ready. Otherwise, I was going to see if Mr. Salazar wanted to explain what we needed to move on. It's up to you.
It was my intention to read in the form of a motion the 4 items contained in our report today so they'd fully be accountable to the record. 1, This is in the form of a motion, adopt appropriate California Environmental Quality Act CEQA findings of fact and certify the final EIR. 2, adopts, this is referring to the board, the mitigation monitoring and reporting program contained in Chapter 4 of the final EIR. 3, adopts a statement of overriding considerations regarding the significant and unavoidable adverse impacts identified in the final EIR. And 4, approves use permit 07-021 for the Sierra Pacific Industries cogeneration power plant project based on the findings and subject to the conditions listed in the resolution.
Second that motion.
I have a motion and a second. Any further comments? All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Thank you. Thank you, gentlemen.
Welcome.
At this time, the Board of Supervisors will recess to a closed session to discuss the following items. It's estimated to take 1.5 hours. With conference with legal counsel considering existing litigation, Rutherford versus County of Shasta, Harry Arthur Kennedy versus State of California et al., Mark Rohrig and Union Pacific Railroad Company et al. The McLaughlin versus County of Shasta has been pulled from our agenda. And we also have a conference with our labor negotiators, Larry Lees, Angela Davis, and Becker and Bell. At the conclusion of our closed sessions, any reportable actions will be reported in open session.
You're being ignored.